It was about delivering that value that allowed them to accept orders, to allow them to react to changes in the market that allowed them to grow. That's sort of where the foundation started. Building. I remember going into one of our early suppliers when I joined my family business here. We didn't we didn't actually do a lot of the production processes in house. We were actually outsourcing a lot of our functions to trade shops, and then we'd come back in and finish it, package it all up, and sell it to a client. So, I remember going into one of my suppliers at the time, and he had a sign on his door, and it was like price, quality, service, pick two. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, in what world do we have to only pick two of these things? Like, if I can offer my clients, within reason, all three of these things at then then I think I'm onto something that's going to end up creating value for them and creating a point of stickiness where they aren't just looking to save an extra penny on a commoditized product because of all the other items and values that we provide to them going forward. So, I think that decision was sort of the start of um, focusing the business on delivering that value, and then everything from there became, what are we doing to deliver that value? What kinds of investments are we making in our equipment? What kind of investments are we making in our technology? What kind of investments are we making in our processes to ensure that we can continue to deliver on those three things? So, I think early on it was just about consistency and consistency and consistency. And you asked the question, you know, what does it take? And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs think there's a magical crystal ball, but I think what gets often underlooked in entrepreneurship is showing up every single day, having consistency, making sure that you're delivering on the value proposition of your business, and then it's about continuously making those investments to enhance the offering that you have and to be able to do it at scale. And I think that traction that we gained early on, that decision to focus on an industry, then created all of the decisions from there that led to us becoming the fastest growing company in Canada.
Well, bud, you just gave us a list. I'm like making notes feverishly here.
Okay.
and and I'm like, man, how are we going to do this?
Okay.
Because this is a 2 hour podcast right here on the list that you gave me. Um, sorry, I'm just completing a note here, and and there's a couple of things here that I'd like to really go back to at the beginning, but there's a lot here to unpack actually. Um, like you know, you talked about price, quality, service, pick two. Like that's the famous triangle of which is you can have three. You're just going to pay for three. If you don't want to pay the money, you're only going to get two. And so, but it's interesting how the mindset of an entrepreneur can get altered, and which I think is actually a core to what you're talking about when you rhymed off a whole bunch of different things. But I actually, if you don't mind, I want to kind of go all the way back to the beginning of what you talked about in 2007. You went to your dad. I found this was really interesting because I had a similar experience when I was young. Um, but you in 2007, your dad didn't want you to join or was skeptical. I'm using my own words here, but didn't want you to join or was skeptical about you joining the company. Going, hey, like you got the track, man. Like you're working, you've got a great job, you're tracking partnership, and your personality and your hard work. You're going to be successful at anything you put your mind to. You're just that person. But it's interesting because like I remember when I was deciding what after high school, I decided not to go to college. Um, and my dad was like, just go to. I actually got accepted to Western. I don't know how. Because my grades sucked, but I think there was a brown envelope we pushed across the table or something. I don't know.
Pick me too, so that's all good.
So, but I remember him saying like, go and drive the corporate ladder, like get your education and climb the corporate ladder. And I'm like, that's not who I knew early on that's not who I was. And I'm like, and I kind of said, like, I'm not climbing somebody's corporate ladder. I'm going to go out and, you're a young kid, right? Talking to your dad. I'm like, I'm going to go out and build my own corporate ladder. But I'm interested in, his perspective and then your perspective on his perspective, because he's an entrepreneur there. And so, talk to me a little bit about that, and maybe even like what you learned from him that you did differently, because he obviously had a perception of climbing the corporate ladder was better than what he was currently doing.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, look, my I was born in East Africa. My parents moved from Kenya when I was pretty young, so they moved to Canada because they wanted us to have a better life, a better education. My dad was pretty senior position in East Africa in sort of a manufacturing company of heavy equipment. So, in his world, he had always been on that corporate ladder. We moved to Canada. Um, he got a job, and then that company ended up getting acquired, and his job sort of was made redundant. And so, he made a decision in 1986, to try to be an entrepreneur. He actually purchased a convenience store that was in Yorkville on the subway line, and that was a 6 day a week endeavor. I remember as kids, my sister and I would go on Saturdays. We'd stock the shelf, we'd eat the inventory. We'd we sort of we'd hide in boxes. I mean, it was just sort of one of those things where that was a Saturday thing our family kind of did, and he did that for a year, and he was like, that was just too much. You know, the, taking too much time away from the family, and so then he decided he was going to try to do something else, and that's when he found this listing to purchase EV Box. And at the time, so EV stands for Eddie Brooks. He was the original owner. We never sort of went around and changed the name, but that was sort of his foray into becoming an entrepreneur. But sort of from that moment, the business was purchased, and at that time, we did a bunch of food distribution that got sold off, and then more into the box side. I would say the business was sort of more of a self-employment job. Like he worked at the business to make enough of a living for himself, but it wasn't really sort of creating a business, creating an organism that was existing on its own. And so when I came to him, I think his view was like, I remember him telling me, he's like, I can't afford to pay, and I was like, also not a problem, right? Like that's, again, those are things in a short amount of time. Like it's a personal sacrifice if I'm taking a pay cut, or maybe I can't go on an extra trip, or I can't go up and trip with my buddies for one night. But that was a willing sacrifice on my part to see if there was an opportunity to unlock something. In his mind, he's like, we came all this way, you went to a good school, you did your CA, like go do your own thing. I don't think he ever had the expectation that I was going to come and join the family business. So I think at first for him, it was a bit of sort of shock and discomfort. That was like, hey, you have your path. But then, when I joined, I think, and as we started working together more closely, I think he was like, oh, you're going to bring, new ideas, new ways of looking at the problems that we're facing. And I think then he started to become a little more excited about that, sort of about the adventure that started in 2007. That sort of gotten to where.
It's amazing. Like, it's a classic immigrant story, right? You come to the country, you have a job, an event happens, you get dislodged, you get into your own business, and it's just really, it really is a classic story, and it's amazing. And then, and I'm really, really interested in your shift at the time. Like, you took a massive pay cut. You've painted the picture that, hey, the business is sustaining the family possibly, but it's not going to sustain, like when I say family, him and your mom. But it's not sustaining, like, generations, and it's not like a big business. It's a small business. He's operating it the way he operates it, and then here you are with this choice. Do I stay, working in an organization? And there's a lot of listeners out here that we have listening to this podcast that I know, because we do the market research, that are in corporate positions, but they desire to go out and do their own thing. Actually, I got a message like a week ago or 2 weeks ago from a listener who said, thank you so much for for the podcast and bringing on some of these guests. They've inspired me. I've quit my job. I've started my business. I'm rocking and rolling, and I was just like, oh my god, congratulations! That's so awesome. And so there's so many people out there that are in this position, and I'm just curious about, like, there's obviously a risk, to that. You're giving up. You would have had a pretty decent job, um, with a very compelling future, for track for growth and evolution in that business, or a competitor. And then you decide, hey, I'm going to take a pay cut. I think, were you guys getting married? Were you and Anna getting married
Nope,
at the
nope.
time?
I
No,
hadn't even
you were single at the
hadn't
time.
met her yet.
Yeah, okay. And so, you about to take this risk. What was going through your head with that? How did you evaluate it? Because I think it's a great conversation for the listeners who are in this situation at any level of, considering risk. But I'm curious how you considered it, and what were some of the things you thought about, or and some of the emotion and feelings that you had.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think personally, much like what you said earlier, I always had the itch to be an entrepreneur. I just I could tell when I was working. I do some stuff, and I remember when I just distinctly remember this was working on a file at the OEC night, and the partner had asked to do some work on it, and I go into his office and I hand him the deck, and he starts putting commas and periods into the work, and I'm like, he didn't add any sort of real, like, it wasn't like there was anything in the work that wasn't correct, and I'm like, I'm multiple steps and time and years away. You follow that process, you have to climb the corporate ladder, and it just wasn't for me. I'm like, I could do this better, I can do it faster. And I think that was the entrepreneurial spirit inside me that was saying, hey, why don't you go give it a shot and see if it's possible. At the time, I'm 27, I'm single, I don't have a lot of downside risk outside of the salary, like outside of pushing compensation down. I felt like this was the perfect time in my life. I was armed with sort of some experience. I worked there for 4 years post school, so I got to see lots of companies. I got to talk to lots of people in the C-suite. I mean, it was a perfect sort of job for you know getting entrepreneurial information and seeing how businesses were running. I thought that it didn't feel like there was a lot of downside for me at that time. And
Go ahead.
yeah, and so making that leap was something that I was sort of willing to take. Um, I think what I find, and I talk to a lot of my friends, and I've gone through the journey, and everyone's kind of seen what it is, and everyone's really excited to see the end of it, and this is what entrepreneurship is about. And I'm like, well, it an overnight success, the fastest growing companies, all that kind of good stuff that's happening now was so many years in the making, so many years of taking risks, so many years of pushing down sort of personal compensation and lots of those things. I think the hard part, as an entrepreneur, as people are making that decision to do something, is like they're looking for the perfect idea. They're looking for, something that's of a lot of certainty, and that's just not necessarily going to be the case. And so, the risk financially for me was one at that time, and I guess the older you get, sort of the more that becomes. But ultimately, entrepreneurship, I at least in my journey, was about showing up, about having some consistency, about understanding that problem and the values that existed, and I think doing all those things gets you so far along the journey of success in being an entrepreneur. And I think a lot of people are afraid to take that step, and all of the things that step requires you to take, the sacrifices that come with taking those steps. And that's where the fear starts to come in to say, hey, I have this cushy job, I'm in the corporate ladder, I'm on this track, everything can be sort of good in this fashion, but it could be great doing something completely different. And that's where people have to get sort of thinking around the risk and the reward, because essentially, as an entrepreneur, that's what all the decisions are about. It's about how much risk you're willing to take and what that potential reward could look like.
Yeah, it's like, when you say that, it's like, to me, the word mindset pops in, right? It's like, you know, where do people have to get to 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 be in the mindset space of, being able to let go of what they have for what they desire most, I guess, maybe, is kind of what I was kind of thinking as you were framing that. It was interesting because you said earlier, like, about, like, you know friends have been with you along the ride, and they see, the success that you've achieved and all that kind of stuff. It's like, people admire the success or perceived success that you have, but none of them want to do the same work that you had to, execute on over time, to get that success. That's the difficult part. And so it's interesting. Like, I'd be curious, what advice would be the one piece of advice you would give somebody who is kind of in your position, when you had to make the decision to make the jump? What would it be? I mean, you obviously had a vehicle, but I think, on the other side too, what you were talking earlier about your father, who bought the EB Box company. I mean, I think a lot of people think they have to start a business when the option of buying an existing business is a very, very enticing option.
Yeah, yeah, you got it. I mean, we're going through one of the greatest, generational transfers of businesses. I mean, when I looked at the family business at the time, I thought a couple things stood out to me that I really loved about it. Like, we're making boxes. I mean, that's a multi-billion-dollar industry in North America. I mean, success in that world is me taking 1/10 of 1/10 of 1/10 of 1% and creating a business out of it. So, like, finding something with that kind of sort of global market, in my mind, de-risk the opportunity, because, again, if you can carve out and operate and deliver value in something that's that large, you can do well. So, to a listener, if you're looking at some opportunities, like, what's the size and scope and scale of that opportunity? Because another one that I looked at also was scalability. So, like, how much of my time, like, how could I leverage my time, in an industry where we can actually grow the business without needing, two, three, four, 10 of me to be able to do it, right? So, I think that was another avenue that I looked at. And then the next thing I noticed when I first joined my dad's company was everyone looked like my dad. I mean, there was sort of not a young person in sight for in the folding carton space. I mean, and I looked at all my dad's competitors, and I said, they don't even have kids in this business. So, what's the long term outlook for this industry? Like, who's bringing the new ideas? Who's thinking about the business in a different manner? I mean, all these people had businesses for a long time. Sure, they were doing really well. They were running antiquated equipment and just sort of milking it, and taking the profits out of the business. And, so you start to look at that and say, well, there's a really large industry. There's not a lot of sort of professionalism and sort of technology. They haven't brought the next level of advancements into it. And, so can I come into this space and bring in what I know and what I've learned, and try to deliver the same product in a different way? And I think that's an important one for people that are looking at opportunities. Is, can I do what's being done today, and can I do it better? If I can do it better, um, you know, would you pay for that? And if you would pay for it, and you can convince somebody else to pay for it, you're on the track towards having the business.
I'm just going to like restate a couple of those things, and I don't know if I caught them all. And if I missed one that you think is really important, please, like, tell me. But the first one I think you talked about was size of industry, like, a fraction of 1% of 1% of 1%. And then, what's the competition doing? What's the industry thinking and the level of the industry thinking? Um, a lot of businesses in that space at the time were just kind of taking profit and not reinvesting it back into the business. And then you said something that was, really, I thought, also really interesting, versus, you kind of said doing something different. And then I don't, I added, like, different slash better. but then I kind of had the thought of versus disruption. Like I feel like sometimes, there's these business speak, right? Where like the buzzwords kind of kick in, and disruption is because of technology. Disruption is a big word, and it sounds like, oh my god, I have to disrupt an industry. If I'm going to get into it, I got to disrupt it. So, well, how do I disrupt it? Oh my god, it's like, how do they turn it into an elephant versus an apple. And I think you just really phrased it super well, that you just have to come in and do. You really sometimes only have to do one thing different or one thing better than the competition, and it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think that's, sometimes as I chat with some of my friends, and all of them are like, hey, most of them are in careers, and now we're at that point in our lives where they're like, oh, we wish we did something entrepreneurial, right? Like that's sort of the thing, and everyone's looking for the next best, greatest idea, this grand master plan that's going to unfold in front of them, and all of a sudden they're going to just leave their job and become bazillionaires because they woke up one morning and thought this through. And I'm like, guys, if you just did this 5 years ago and you just the same sort of effort that you've been putting into thinking about this master plan, but you just kind of put one foot in front of another, found a business, you can buy a whole bunch now, you can start something, but find a business, look at the optionality, look at the scope of the market, and you actually took that focus and went every single day and worked. It reminds me of like that. I don't know if it was Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger, but the eighth wonder of the world is compounding interest, right? And I feel the same way about your business. Like, if you're in there and you're continuously working at it, and then you make a little bit of money, you take that money, you put it back in, start investing in your business, you start to see a phenomenon. And similar to maybe the original question about fastest growing, I started in 2007. We started hitting that list in 2012 or 2013, and we've been on that list consistently ever since, all the way up until 2024. Those first 5 years were
Brutal,
a
problem.
struggle.
I'm sure they
Those
were
first five
brutal.
years were yeah, they were pretty brutal. I mean, there was sort of no free cash flow when I joined, and so every single dollar that came out, it was a deferral of our lives. I remember when I met my wife, and we started watching in the early 30s, like our friends started buying houses, and they were like, this friend bought a house, and that friend bought a house, that friend bought a house, and we were really behind. We had our condos, but we bought our first house at 37. Right. Meanwhile, most of my friends had been in houses, and they caught that big run of the housing market, and everything was like, they bought their house, and then the market started going crazy, and we're like, oh, we just missed, and it got more expensive, more expensive, more expensive. And I'm like, don't worry, whatever the cost is, when we have to put, we'll buy it when we have to buy it. But the money spent in the business is turning so much of a better return for us, that you'll deal with the extra cost of the house. It'll be much easier to deal with then than taking all that money now out of the business to 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 keep up with your friends and buy this home, and then not reinvest that capital inside the business. And so, that's where that compounding effect starts to really take place, and that's where you can really scale and have that growth, opportunities. The first $1 million of sales, the first month, those are the hardest things to achieve. And once you start achieving those things, then you can really start to deploy capital in a meaningful way to be able to generate scale inside the
Yeah,
business.
I mean, it's very true. I just want to circle back to one point that you made about the shift in business ownership. This is going to be the greatest shift of businesses that we've ever seen, hands down. I mean, it's going to be massive. And the opportunity out there, and I think there's a lot of people that don't know how to buy a business. So I am actually going to make a plug here. My mentor, Keith Cunningham, he runs a online workshop slash course called How to Buy a Business, Keys to the Vault, How to Buy a Business. I'm only saying him. I don't take a cut off of this. Like I've said a million times, I don't monetize this podcast. But I've sent my CFO to that course. I've been to the course twice, um, and it is really, 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 really good. He is super, super, super smart, and I think a lot of people just don't necessarily know how to buy a business. They don't know what to say to the buyer, or to the seller. They don't know how to form the process, and he lays it all out. And so it's really really good. And maybe, maybe we'll do a mini kind of thing online. I'm always looking for ideas to to be able to, you know teachable or coachable moments and processes. So maybe we'll do like a little skinny version of what he teaches, and then people could go to him if they want to go deeper. Um but buying a business, starting a business, oh my god, like I've done it. I've probably done, equal amount of times of starting versus buying. um all of them I've probably done way too many of, which is what I love about your story. Is like you guys are in the box business and you've stuck in the box business. And sometimes I think, boy, if I just had stayed in one industry, what could I have accomplished in that industry? And I'm not that I'm complaining, um, but I think, there's startups are hard, and there's no sense of certainty on the other side. And typically, you're looking 5 to 7 years before you even remotely, like typically a startup, you're not making money for 5 years. I think that's probably around the average if you Googled it, and I may be wrong, but I probably won't be that wrong. Um, but if you're buying a business, you're buying it based on its, EBITDA, a multiple of EBITDA. It's going to be made. So unless you go in there and blow it up, you have a defined risk, which goes to our conversation earlier about, leaving your current situation and or staying. So I think that's like something the audience should be really kind of cognizant of. And I don't know, are you guys buying like in the box business, like, or what have you guys done to grow?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fully organic to this date, but definitely at this point, to keep taking those iterative leaps in your business, we're open to acquiring. The hard part that we've sort of seen is we have a recipe. I think, um, we're on our 16th brand new piece of equipment in the last 4 years. So we've really like just entirely changed the way that our company operates. And so sometimes when we're going to look at businesses, we're like, well, we like your book of business, but we don't really love the assets and the things that are coming along with it. We're paying a premium to sort of get this. Should we consider greenfielding this and building it on our own and see what the opportunity, or do you build something else and then roll in, like sort of buy someone with no equipment, a bit of not a lot of goodwill left in the plant, and sort of suck in their book of business. So those are the kind of things that we would consider. But I think what you said was really important, because when I made the leap, I was 27 and felt like what I joined was almost similar to a startup. And I remember telling my wife, I'm like, I'm gonna like close my eyes, put my head down, and work at this till I'm 40. We started having kids, and I'm like, I want to make sure that I have time with my children, and as much as was possible. But I would tell her all the time, I would not do this again. I would not start from zero. I think that if your listeners are in that age, like maybe that's an opportunity. You don't have a bunch of capital, you can't buy a business. Maybe you want to start something small and see where you can, or maybe you buy something small. But the older you've gotten, and the more you've gotten used to having some certainty of a paycheck, the entrepreneurial leap, if you have a business and you're buying it and has EBITDA and the owner was able to take out some salaries, like the entrepreneurial leap isn't go to zero and have nothing going on for the next bunch of years. If you buy something where, you think you can add value on top of what the entrepreneur that was in there was already doing, that's where you can unlock the potential for that business, and that's where you can make money. And that's kind of the situation that I got to walk into. Had an older generation, you know, mentality around the business, and sure, maybe it was fine, but imagine what we could do if you bring in some of the other ideas and professionalism and risk tolerance that maybe doesn't exist, with the current entrepreneur that you're looking to exit. That's where you can start to really unlock some value. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that buying something, as you get older in your journey is likely the way to go. To be able to make that leap with some level of comfort.
So, based on like, and I love the advice. It's super. I mean, it's a great topic. And you had said just a few minutes ago that you have a recipe, and I'd love to just kind of unwind that statement and the recipe. I mean, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but at one point in time when we were meeting, I think I was taking a tour of your facility actually, and I was kind of looking around, and I'm like, where's the sales team? Like, what do they work out of? And you're like, well, we don't have a sales team. Is that still true?
Yeah, we just hired someone starting in January. So again, we're looking to build that part of the business out. But we've been pretty fortunate up until now. It's been relatively organic, and that's why I think we're 92% food, because you do something, the industry's small, you do something really well for somebody, and then somebody else in the jam, and they're at some food show or they're part of a little network, and they're like, you know what, who helped us? ED Box helped us out of that jam. And then I get a phone call from somebody else who says, I know you helped this person, and that's sort of how the spiral, started to happen. We'd go into the grocery store early on. Our the sales strategy was we'd go into the grocery store. I remember my very first client, and I went in there and I said, you know how am I going to get these guys to leave where they were and join us? And at that point, that was like 30% growth for us on our revenue. Like landing this was landing like a massive fish. And I remember walking to their office and hearing that they were getting their stuff, but they just didn't have a good enough. They needed a rush. And they didn't have a good enough relation. But there was a gap, and I said, look, you're talking to the owner. Here's my card. Here's my cell phone number. If you ever need anything, you're not calling this person to get to that person to get that person to get you an answer in 2 days. You call me, I'll have you an answer. And lo and behold, they started using it, and we started delivering. And then they started using it and started delivering. And to this day, they're still a client. We've grown with them all the way through. And I remember last year, and now, you know, they had a professional, they had a proper CEO in place. And I'm away with my dad on a trip, and we're in Italy, and I get a phone call, and I see it, and I answer the phone while I'm in Italy, and she says to me, Irfan, we're in a massive jam. Our planning team didn't order. We have this massive order that's going out. And I said, no problem. Made a phone call to the office, and 2 days later, they had their packaging, and we saved the day. And fast forward now, and I'm at an event, and the CEO happens to be in YPO. And so I meet her at an event, and we start chatting, and she had moved on, and she goes, "You don't know what that meant for us. Like, you saved us like $1 million order by doing that thing." And I'm like, that. And she's like, thank you, thank you. And I'm like, you don't have to thank me. That's the value we provide. That's why people use us. That's why we've been successful in the food space. And so, when we landed them early on, I would go into the grocery store and I'd be like, okay, they would have a freezer section with their product, and then I'd see two or three other competitors in there, and I'd call the competitor and be like, hey, well, you know, they're never out of stock. They're always doing a good job. Why are you not using us? And then we would own this freezer section, then this freezer section, then this freezer section, and then they would all start talking, and that's sort of how the business started to grow. I think where we're getting to now in terms of our growth journey is to continue this. We need to have a larger, sort of sales team, and empower them to be able to go out and replicate the offering at a larger scale, to be able to knock on some more doors. And now our job internally has become, how do we provide them with that back end support, from a process perspective, from an equipment perspective. For us to continue to grow and scale, we need to make sure that we're supporting the external opportunity that exists through investment. And that's why we've put 16 pieces of equipment. That's why we continue to look at developing, our equipment set, because that's been our mission from day one. Most manufacturing companies look at their equipment and say, we want to run it at 100% capacity. We want to run 3 shifts. We want to do all the stuff, and we want to, like, that's how they calculate the payback of that piece of equipment. We've never looked at it that way. Our view has always been that I'd like to run the business with 20% spare capacity, because that 20% spare capacity is the value that my clientele needs when they need a rush. I can't tell them, the big guys in our industry, they just tell them, sorry, it's 12 weeks. You'll get your packaging in 12 weeks. That's the end of story. And I'm like, that is the fastest way to lose a client. I mean, the value that we've offered them from day one is a value that we have to continue to offer them. If that means that I have to buy an extra piece of equipment, then I have to buy. That's my decision as a business owner, to be able to continue to deliver the original value proposition that we offer to our customer base. And that shouldn't change. Otherwise, we're changing the way we do business. We're changing the way our customers interact. And if that's something that they desire, they'll find somewhere else to go get it. Right. So that's been a pretty important thing for us as we've continued on the growth journey. Is the investment in technology has been super important for us to continue to have price, right? You know, you can buy it; it's a commodity, but you're going to only buy it if we're within the range of somebody else. So price is still a consideration. We don't have to be the cheapest, but we have to be in the ballpark. Quality can't output crappy product and hope that somebody is going to be okay with that. That's their brand on the shelf. And as a consumer, you're looking at the packaging as your first point of contact for buying something, and then the service. And so, for us, when it comes to investing in technology, it's been, very important for us to have the latest and the greatest equipment in our facility so that we can compete on all three of those, points of that triangle without having to turn around and be like, you have to sacrifice something.
Yeah, sorry, the 3 points of the triangle: quality, service. What was the first one? Price. Okay. So the original triangle we're talking about. So I'd love to unpack this a little bit more. And because you are 12 years in a row, I'm going to say this again, 12 years in a row, one of Canada's fastest growing companies, and you don't have a sales department. And, I find that like, uh, you know, most people who go, oh, we got to have a social media campaign and we got to have sales reps on the road and we have to have all these things, and you defy every single one of those rules. And you are and you've achieved unbelievable success. And earlier and I wrote this in quotations, which was, we have to provide additional care. And so what I'd love to do is kind of try to unpack this in a way that the listener is kind of like, whether they're in the box industry or they're in the service industry, the restaurant industry, like how do we like unpack this in terms of, your processes, from the early days, right? Like in, you said in '08 you got into the food, like more into it, and you're now 92% in the food business, for food packaging. What were you prior? Was it just general boxes for any industry?
Yeah. We do a little bit of cosmetics, a little bit of nutraceuticals, a little
Yeah,
bit of
kind of
automotive parts, like
chasing everything and
just sort
anything.
of, yeah. What you got it. Whatever orders were coming at the time when you're the size we were, you were taking orders, right? I mean, that's you did what you had to do to keep the machines turning. Um, but that also just left you sort of fragmented in terms of your thinking around, what are we selling, what are we providing, how do you want to account for, um, dealing with those things. They all had different requirements. If you're an automotive part, you can buy as many boxes as you want, you can build as many widgets and parts and stick them in a warehouse. You don't really have the need for service. Like, you sort of can buy what you need, pack what you need, stick it somewhere, and you'll just deal with inventory holding costs, and you'll be able to sell that. Like, that was more on the price side of the equation of things that we wanted to look at. But on the food side, it's perishable. Your nutritional decks can change. Regulatory changes all the time. You can't just go build a million of these things and stick them in a big freezer and then let them be, right. And so, in addition to that, you had multi SKU, you had all sorts of things that were going on inside your business, and really understanding how to run that, how to plan it, how to execute it was something that we used to hold the hands of our customers. Like, I used to have customers come to me and say, "I want to run this, 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 and this, and this." The 10 SKUs, and they'd have a mixed product and they'd want to run it. And if you just took that quote request and you went to a big shop, somebody would be sitting there at a desk and they would receive this quote request and they would quote it as you asked. And then you get a price. And we would see what you asked for. We would figure out the optimization of running this. And I'd come to you and I'd say, you know what? You want 5,000 of this, but if you could take 6,000 of this one and you want a 6,000 of this, and if you could take 7,000 of that one, I could save you 10%.
Right.
And they'd be like, what? And, it was almost apples to apples. Like, they were just getting a few extra boxes that they were going to ultimately be
But it
able to
made a
use that
difference on your
save.
manufacturing side in terms of production. You're probably making the same amount of money, or maybe even a little more, but it's really saving them. Okay, so so there's a couple of things here, like because one, and this is my hallucination, but when you decided to get into the food business, it wasn't about the size because you when the comment you did make, and I want to make sure the listener kind of gets this because it's like you're like, well, the size we were, we had to get business from everywhere. That's not exactly what you said, but it was to that version. But it wasn't size that allowed you to move into the food business. It was a shift in your mindset. You saw sounded earlier like you saw a opening in the market. There was an opportunity. You kind of I'm sure you reflected on a bunch of your lines of business and went, this is where the opportunity is. So like it sounds to me like it was hey, let's pull back and just take a deep look at our business. Especially there's nothing better than crisis to make you look at your business. It's like, and we just all went through it in the pandemic as well, where you're in there going, like, holy geez, we're down by 50% or we're down by 80%. We need to look at how we do this. Look at the restaurant business. Like, I was at a restaurant a little while ago and I'm watching like the takeout. And I said to the girl, I'm like, how much of your business is takeout? And she's like, oh, it's probably 45%. I'm like, 45%? You have 45% going out the door? And she's like, yeah. And I said, was it like that before COVID? She's like, no, we didn't do any takeout. Like like a few bucks. And I'm like, your restaurant's full and you have 45%. Like, she's like, oh, our business is like, we're double. And she goes, we just got really good at doing takeout. And it was a huge distinction. That business was there before. Yeah, did we shift a bit social and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, absolutely. There's a shift in the environment. No question about it. But it's how you react to the shift in the environment that really gets you to where you are. So I'm curious, like, can you just kind of maybe we just I don't know how we're going to do this because but I'll let you flow it and we'll just chat about it. But I'd really like for you to just kind of go, hey, okay, here's what happened. There was a crisis, and we looked at the business and we made a bet that we are going to go into the food business, and then because you said some like unbelievable stuff about like consistency and additional care and the way you're investing in your business. You've got no salespeople. You've got like, uh, but there was points where you kind of reach out to the customer. So I just kind of like would love to just kind of unpack this for the listeners so that they walk away with almost a guiding process of, if I wanted to increase my business 20%, here's some of the areas I could go look at, and here's some of the levers I could pull in order to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for us, look, it was, we were, when I joined, it was pretty bootstrapped, right? So, annual revenues were pretty small, not throwing up a lot of free
Do
cash.
you mind? Can you say what
And I,
were you doing like back then? You don't have to if you don't want to, but
yeah, we were sub
okay,
a million.
so it's not
Yeah, we
like
were
in the
sub a million
manufacturing
annual.
business.
Yeah,
That's not a lot.
yeah.
Yeah,
No, no, no.
you
Yeah, it
guys
was
aren't
not.
making a
It
ton of money,
was.
that's for sure. Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, it was a lot of sub a
a
million. So
lot of
yeah,
sub a million.
we were down there. We weren't making a ton of money at the time, and so I think it was sort of a bit serendipitous, a bit out of necessity. Like, it wasn't like the financial crisis happened and our business fell apart. The business was kind of the business. There wasn't really a whole lot of downside. We had a bunch of fragmented customers in a bunch of different industries. It wasn't like that was a big pressure point for us. But I think what we ended up seeing was that during that time where everyone was scared and there was fear and stock market was crashing, and you didn't have a bunch of money, and you know a little bit like what we might kind of be seeing, and we had sort of during that time of COVID, where people were really worried and sort of buckling up, that food wasn't something that they were buckling up on, that they still had to eat. And as a matter of fact, because they got more and more busy, they went to, like you just mentioned, takeouts 45%. Like, hey, I'm so busy, I'm coming home from work and I got to do something. Guess what? I'm going to phone somebody and pick something up, and I'm going to show up at home and I'm going to have a meal prep. That never used to be the case. My mom would go to the grocery store, she'd buy whatever was on sale, and that's what was for dinner. Like, I mean, that was part of her daily responsibility and journey. Now people have gotten so busy, convenience has increased, food quality has increased in grocery and as takeout, and so those kinds of shifts have happened, and we started to see that in '08 when that sort of first round of layoffs and the economy sort of stalling, was that people had less and less time to do that, and more time to spend whatever dollars they had was still going towards food. And so, I think for us at that time, it was a bit serendipitous. Like, we saw something happening, and we said, that's the space that we kind of want to be in. And then we got that first customer who was in the food space, and we really started to understand, like, they needed a whole lot more than just a box and a price, and they didn't realize it. They didn't realize it. What they would end up having to do was their incumbent supplier would just say no, and then they would have to deal with rearranging their production schedules, saying no to the retailers, missing opportunities. And I think that's where is part of the reason why we didn't have a sales team, or we don't have it up until now. We experienced a lot of our growth organically because I think we grew with a lot of our clients, giving them the ability to go say yes, like giving them the ability to go take on a project where I'm not even sure they would have known if they were with their previous supplier. They might have just kept saying no and saying that's normal business. Now they're saying yes, and their business is growing because they're filling the shelves. They're always in stock. They're available. The retailers love them. The fill rates are good. Those kinds of things were symbiotic. We used to look at it and say, I'm an extension of your business. Like, I'm not something that you just procure and we don't talk about it ever again. Like, I want to be there. I want to be there for parts of your conversation. I want to know what do you need? Like, hey, I need something done in 3 days. It's so meaningful to my business, and then I'm going to make sure that
So,
that happens.
sorry,
You know,
I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't want this to get too deep that we can't retrace for the listener. So right now I have written down crisis and fear basically equals decision. That was my takeaway. Then you make a decision and you go into the food industry, and then you really didn't know the food. It's not like it doesn't sound like you were an expert in the food industry and you had a stream of clients already, and you're like, hey, we see an opportunity. You saw a global opportunity that, hey, people are gonna, this is where it's trending, and the food industry, everybody has to eat, same as like, like the pet industry. People will starve. People will always have to eat unless they have to feed their pet.
that's right. Then
Right.
the pets eat first. Yeah, then their pets eat first for
Exactly.
sure.
Or it's like,
Yeah.
or they're going to get diapers before. Like, these are the kinds of industries or the products that people are not going to say no to. They're not going to turn away from them. They may not go out for dinner at the high end restaurant when they can't necessarily afford it, or the economy is turning downward, or there's uncertainty. But they will, maybe go to whatever, a lower priced option. Um, so you make the decision, but inside the decision, what were you starting to see? Like, it sounds to me, and one of the questions that popped into my head was like, you didn't have a sales department, so you were really driving those conversations at that level of the business. Um, and I believe you still actually drive. I know you take calls from your big clients, but and this is kind of one of the questions that I have is, did you find as the owner of the business being out there with the clients, instead of behind your desk worried about the manufacturing, which I'm not saying you weren't, but there's, that's an easier system to duplicate versus Irfan, the personality, the owner of the business, the representative of what service, quality, and price means to your company for your customer. Um, that you kind of, do you find that you get into offices of decision makers easier because you're the owner? Yeah.
100% for sure. I mean, I think that goes without saying, and I think that our clients really appreciate and value that connection, that level of service. Like I said to you the very first time where I walked in and said, "Here's my card. You can call me anytime." Was it just a gesture? I mean, hey, if you're going to use it, you're going to use it, and I'm going to be happy to answer the call. But some do and some don't. But I think that was a really important thing. I think that's why a lot of our customers still choose to deal with someone like us instead of going to a big multinational conglomerate, because you do have that point of touch where if something's needed, if they need to get something done quickly or they have an urgency, that they can still chat with you. They can still chat with my team, right from top to bottom. Our team really understands. That's one thing I'll say internally is everyone understands the value that we're trying to deliver. Like, it's not just me saying it and then you deal with somebody else and they're like, yeah, well, it's no big deal. It's like, no, we're on high alert. You have requests come in, and they're urgent. I want you to be on it. But I've still got customers that will, my team and their team are talking and they're doing something, and that urgency is even higher than what that is. I'll still get that phone call up until today, and I welcome it because I want them to be able to communicate so we can understand what we can do to help. I mean, if our mindset is always learning from our clients and understanding what we can do to help, what I can do to help you is something that I can do to help somebody else. And so if that is something of value, if I can put in a process, if I can put in a piece of technology or equipment or a person or whatever it is, I want to then take that. I want to take that information and I want to be able to offer it across the board to everybody else, right? And so, the constant feedback loop that we've been getting, since we started this, has been really important. I mean, for me in business, that the first mistake is always on us. As an owner manager, I look at my team and I'm like, hey, if something is a mistake, we'll put a process, we'll put a control, we'll put procedures. Then it comes down to, have I trained you? And then it comes down to, do I have the right person in my company, doing that job? And so we really believe that, mistakes or information that's coming from our clients is always a learning for us to be better as a company. I remember I tell my dad, I'm like, being an entrepreneur is probably the most expensive MBA he could have paid for, right? Like, you could have sent me to school and just paid the tuition and been done. But, as an entrepreneur, you have to be prepared to make mistakes and learn from them. And it's that continuous iteration over time that makes the business more buttoned down and able to generate, sort of consistency and scale.
So I will say, for anybody who's listening, this business does not own you. I've had the privilege of spending multiple days with you in consecutive days in a row, and you are not like taking phone calls, and you've created a system that this business is running, and congratulations to you with that. I don't want people to walk away from this conversation thinking, "Oh my God, but you could do that," and "Oh my God, the business is going to own me, and I'll always be on the phone," and all that. That is not true. I can personally attest to what you've done. Obviously, created a training regimen and you have hired people who know what they're doing and how to do it, but of course when the shit hits the fan, they know who to call, and you're going to pick up the phone and answer for them. Um, so I had step one: crisis fear equals decision. Once you decide, search for the gap is kind of what I've written down so far. And once you find the gap, whatever that might be, and if there's some tweaks but to me it just sounded like, get in front of your customer, find out where their pain points are, where that gap is, and once you've found the gap, find a way to fill the gap. And the third thing I wrote down was, make sure that they're certain. And as the owner, you get to do this, but when you pass your card and say, if there's a problem, you have a direct line. Here's my cell phone. Just call me. And that is, as an owner, at some level in the business, is a bit of a risk, because now you're getting phone calls that you may not be as qualified as the people that are actually working for you to answer those phone calls, but it does give the certainty that the customer needs, especially if they're new. Once they've been an established customer, they know, I'm not calling Irfan. He didn't know. Like,
Yeah,
I'm gonna
that's right.
call
That's right.
Susie,
Yeah,
the
that's right.
production manager, or something, right? Or
You got it.
design or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Would you
yeah.
say that I've kind of? Is there another one you would add to?
No, I mean, I think that's right. Like, once you figure out the gap and you understand what the question or the problem is that you're trying to solve. I mean, like, that's where you really start to be able to focus your business. That's where you start to be like, everything from that moment on is, I'm doing X to make sure that I deal with Y, whatever that customer problem is. If I'm hiring someone, if we're putting in a procedure, if we're putting in a policy, if we're putting in a piece of equipment, everything is a singular focus to deliver the resolution to that problem that we've heard. And every time we understand it's a problem, or we understand, what the customer wants, we look at that as an opportunity. It's now my job as the entrepreneur to figure out how to solve that and how to do it with scale and automation, so that it doesn't feel like it's cumbersome every single time it comes to fruition. And that's really how the business starts to build itself. Is once you've understood that, your job now is to put the pieces in place behind that to support that gap that you've identified.
Okay. So this one, I think this is really important because there's so many people out there that they don't know how to grow their business. And I know I've said this a couple of times already, but you know, you're a 12-time fastest growing company in Canada recipient, like without a sales team. So I think this stuff is like so important, and it's not necessarily found or articulated as simply and targeted as you're kind of laying it out. So I'm super appreciative of this, Irfan. And so if I seem like I'm being redundant, I'm being redundant, a, selfishly, because I'm a businessman and this serves me, but more importantly, it serves our listeners. And so I went to search for the gap, you know find, fill the gap, provide the customer certainty that you can do that. And then you had said focus your business, build a singular focus to meet, achieve. I added this in: meet and achieve and service that gap. And then the fourth thing, which I feel like you were leading into, was like build a machine to scale it. Would you say that would be the next step?
Yeah, I was going to say that, as you mentioned, the whole sales cycle, like, to me, sales is a team effort. It's not like, hey, that's just a one person job. And so I have a strong team behind me. When it comes to onboarding customers, if it's pre-press, if it's structural design, if it's our customer service department, if it's our logistics group, like, we're introducing the client to a suite of things that they need. But we spent a lot of time on the back end building that, so that when we do bring in new business, like, I would like to spend, as the owner of a business trying to grow it, and I think I have a good pulse of what we were trying to offer our clients, and things like, I want to spend my time having those conversations about the value that we can provide to our clientele. But then I can also be involved with all of the processes that come with the day to day of onboarding somebody, and what happens, and where's my order, and where's my artwork, and things like, you need that team around. So sales, knocking on the door and getting that lead, that's one function of what this is. But it encourage people to sort of, yeah, the worst thing is getting that sale and then not delivering it, or not being able to integrate it or onboard it, right? And so on that back end, when we talk about you know investing, it's not just investing in equipment and being able to do the job, but it's also investing in our team. It's investing in our process. What does it look like from the moment that customer comes into our door to the moment our product leaves? And have they felt that to be somewhat seamless? Because the number one in our space, the number one issue for a client is the devil you do versus the devil you don't, right? Like, that's a hard one when you're in business trying to switch somebody away. Is they've been working with an incumbent supplier, and it's kind of been working. They don't really know until they move over all the things that they've been missing. Early on in our that very first client I was going back to, like, they didn't realize when their incumbent was just kept saying no, 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 or it's coming in 3 or 4 weeks, what that was doing to their business. The number of times they had to say no to a retailer, the number of times they had to say no to an opportunity. When they moved over, they were like, holy moly, like, it was eye opening for them. And we then saw their business start to grow, and we grew together. And so, that's always a hard part. And so we want to make sure when our customers are coming on board that we've planned that back end. We have the support, we have the team, we have the systems. We even went as far as, when we moved to our new facility, like, we got this plant food certified. So we actually have our GFSI food certification in this plant. That's not something that we need. That's something that all of our clients have, because they're the ones dealing with food. And we sat there and we're like, hey, look, there's not a bunch of box companies that have this. But what makes that sales transaction easier for me or for anybody else that has to go knock on the door to a food client if you tell them, oh, by the way, we're going to make your box and we're going to do it in a food certified facility. That already starts to de-risk their feeling of changing from where they are to where they want to go. So, I think those are the kinds of things that are important when we look at the sales cycle as well, to say, okay, we understand what your pain is, we understand what all the reasons why you might say no are, and I want to knock each and every one of these things down and be able to give you an offering where you start to feel comfortable in trusting us. And then the moment you bring that over, I have to then deliver on the back end of, do you have all the people in place that, and do I have the technology, do I have all the equipment to be able to do what I said I was going to do? The moment all those things happen, you start to have a captive
Yeah,
client.
it's a raving fan at that time, at that point. Um, so here's my question, is, and I want to make sure, because I think inside of building the machine, I think sometimes it gets a little difficult. I mean, any owner can get stuck in any part of the process. If they're a sales guy, they're going to get stuck in the sales process. If they're a kind of person, they're going to get stuck in the process and not really focus on the sales or the service or whatever. But so when it comes to building machine to scale it, the first thing I wrote down was identify. Well, first thing I wrote down was build teams, and then the second thing I wrote down was identify the process. Like, like identify what the process needs to look like, and AKA at this stage, as you're starting to grow and you're starting to scale, what the business looked like at 1 million or 2 million looks a lot different at 5 or 10 million. And so, what does that look like for you guys? Even earlier in the earlier days, like, was this, were you getting together in a boardroom? Were you hashing this out? Was this, individually, like you saw the vision and you kind of made it happen and executed it to happen? But I'm just curious if we can build machines sector is just, or section is just kind of hack this out a little bit for the listener. Whether it's, in my head, I see identifying the process, like the full process, as an initial stage, not the initial stage, and then obviously building teams is going to be critical, because if you don't have people, it's not going to scale. But then there's got to be some other pieces, I guess, maybe in the identifying the process stage.
I mean, it's a great question. I think it's the the secret sauce or whatever we called it. I mean, I think that's where a lot of that stuff comes from. When I first joined the company, I remember the first day I get in my dad's office and someone calls with an order, and he writes it on a piece of paper. Like, he's cut cardstock from waste in the plant. Oh, he's gonna kill me. And he's writing the order on a piece of paper. Then he hands it to some guy in the back, and then that guy like goes and picks the order, and then he crosses stuff off this list, and then we go back to another computer system, and then rekey stuff in, and I'm like, oh my god, my head's gonna explode. Like, this is completely crazy. And if you don't show up at work tomorrow, like, who's doing any of these processes? And I remember, like, in that beginning being like, it's in like we couldn't take on 10 more clients. If this was a process, you would become the bottleneck. And so it was always around alleviating bottlenecks in our company to allow scale. I think that was one thing that we looked at very closely. And then it was also around how do we replicate the same transaction over and over again in a consistent manner, right? Because the way most entrepreneurs do it, and I'm guilty of this, and as the company morphed, you start to realize you can't be, but you're likely the best at doing a lot of the things that exist in your company. And so as an entrepreneur, you're like, well, I can just do that, and I can do this, and I can do this, and I can do that, and I can do that too, right? And so if that's your mentality, you start to get your hand in every single thing, and then you get stretched really thin, and then you can't focus on things that actually are driving value of the business, and you can become an operator of a business generating income for yourself very, very quickly without actually thinking around what it's going to take to turn this into a business where it's running and I'm working on the business instead of working inside the business all the time. And those are distinct timelines. Like, we talk about my life today, much more flexibility, able to do a bunch of things. But there was a time in this journey where that wasn't the case. And as an entrepreneur, I think as anybody that's considering to do something like this, like understanding that that's going to be an expectation. There's going to be things that you miss. It's a 24/7 job. There's days where I'm at home, early on in the business, and I'm sitting there at 10 o'clock at night thinking about the business. I'm thinking about it in the morning. I mean, to say that that ever ends is probably not true. I think you're always constantly involved in thinking about your business, but there's no off switch. There isn't sort of a, hey, I punched the clock at 5 o'clock and now I'm going to go do something else. Like that sort of world, kind of doesn't exist. And so it's that continual focus on the mission and the goal. But early on in that process phase, I was like, hey, if we don't do certain things here, if we don't start to professionalize this process, then it's just you and I. Now I'm looking at my dad's thing. It's just you and I that can do these things, and everyone else is standing around saying until they get direction from us, they can't do something. And so, the first thing I did when I came in was like, forget the sales side. We need to look at all our processes. We need to look at our procedures. We need to be able to understand what's the client interaction look like. How does someone transact with us? How do we communicate that inside our plan? That was a big thing. That said, if we continue to do it the way we were doing it, we were not going to be able to achieve any scale. And then you start to build some things, and then they work, and then they grow, and then you improve on it. And again, it's about that constant iteration of like, where did we find a pain point? Where do we find a block? Can we build a new process, or can we build a system, or can we automate something? And I remember in the beginning it was like just as easy as order entry, and then it went to like, how are we invoicing, and how are we identifying information, and how are we matching POs and things. And then it went to production tickets, and I built our production ticket system on Excel, and we had an Excel tracker, and every single time we did a job, we put an Excel and create a docket. And then fast forward, and then that moved to an ERP system. And now, like, I look at the business and I kind of smile, because I created every single process, form, report that we used. And when I look at it today, I'm like, we don't use half the stuff I created. Like it's morphed into something else. Sometimes I'm like, I shouldn't admit some podcasts. One of my guys might listen. Some of them like, I don't even know how to do that report thing on the ERP system, right? And so it's kind of satisfying. Like, I remember 2 years ago thinking to myself, I remember sitting in my office one day and having this distinct thought, being like, I don't have anything to do, right? Like people used to come and like I had this day to day buzz in my life, and then I'm like, now we've put this team and the structure and the systems and everything have morphed. Like it's turned into a bit of an organism. And then you look around and I'm like, you know, there's no one crashing through my door saying you need to answer this question or we can't move forward. And that's where you start to see some of the other good parts of entrepreneurship. Like that's where the bit more of the freedom and things come in, where you start to say, you know what, I'm not in the business anymore. I'm now having a chance to operate on the business and think about it and think strategically, and what are our plans going to be, and how are we going to get to where we have to get
Okay,
to.
I'm gonna have you hold on that, because I'm gonna come back to that, because I think I wrote that piece down, but I don't want to get lost on this build the machine thing, and I want your expertise for our listeners, because this is awesome, bro. Like, so we're identifying the process, we're building the teams, we're finding the bottlenecks, and we're removing them. I made a note of, be careful of the phrase I can do this, I can do that, I can. How do we monitoring how we transact with our customers? I think that was a really interesting point. And then what can we automate? And then what else would you add to that whole build the machine process for scaling?
Yeah, so I think first it started with us. It was all internal. It was look within our business and say, what can we do better to make this experience. It was all about the customer's experience. Like, we wanted to be easy to deal with. I wanted you to, sort of from the moment you sent the order, everything came back, it matched, it reconciled. Like, you weren't spending a lot of time the way we used to do before. You would send me A and I would send you B, and you would spend 5 minutes of your time trying to reconcile what I sent you to what you sent me. And that was just a bad, in my opinion, a bad customer experience. Even though all the information was there and you could figure it out, it wasn't seamless on how we wanted to do it. So the first 6 months I was in this business, it was purely work internal. Once you get past the internal work and the processes, and as long as you're committed to continuously iterating and improving, then it became the other side of scale. So now that customers are having good experience, now that we have an internal process that's going to allow us to communicate faster and with more consistency and with more accuracy to be able to do more work and grow the business, what are we doing now from a investment and a technology perspective to support the incremental abilities in our process? And so then you start to look at, okay, what pieces of equipment are going to allow us to deliver the greatest and the fastest value for the problem that we're trying to solve for our customers. And once you do that, then the machine starts building. You start realizing, oh well, great. You know what? People love this. Our process is good. Now we're delivering. We're getting more orders. We realize that our process is no longer able to support this next level of orders. That's how you move from this system to another system of automation to another system. And so it's starting to recognize, okay, we're back to take a pause, iterate, improve, because what you don't want to do, but what we didn't want to do, is get to a point where you grow, you grow so fast and so quickly that the customer experience starts to become bad and you start dropping the ball. So it's like, take a pause, let's clean up all of these things where we're finding pain points internally to be able to deliver, and then that allows you to take your next phase of growth, and then that follows with some more support on equipment that then just keeps on, like that's where the machine starts to come together. Like it's a feedback loop. You start to grow the business, you get a little bit of information, you start to improve that process side of your business, you start to invest in more technology, and that's how the machine morphs into what it is today, where you know the business and the systems and the things that are happening are now being controlled by a multitude of people, and everyone knows what the end goal is, and we're all working towards trying to make trying to
Yeah,
make that
I
happen.
love it. I love it. I like the piece where you said invest in technology and equipment that adds value to your customer. Not you didn't say that it increases the profit and loss statement, or makes things more efficient, or and to your point earlier in the podcast, you'd mentioned like we keep 20% of our production available. There's not a lot of companies that do that. Like that is, I mean, you know, when you said it, I went, you know, that's the beauty of being able to do something when you're not a public company too, right? You're not, you'd never be able to get away with that if you're a public company. Your shareholders and your board would be all over you. Um,
For sure. I think I said it earlier. Like it was never about like how to try to make more money. I think originally when I first started, it's funny. We're two accountants. My dad's an accountant. I'm an accountant, so we're both kind of nerdy and quantitative to that extent. And I remember starting at this business, and I did a 60 a projection until I was 65, like where the business was today, how much growth I could have, how much profitability would sort of come out of this business, and at the end of this thing, there would be like this little golden nugget, and I'd be really happy. And every single year we went into the business, I used to track like where were sales, like how old was I and where were our sales, how old was I, where was our profitability. And I think at 32, I'd hit the end of that sort of road. And then I started to realize, I'm like, this was not about it wasn't about the money, because at that point you were just like, this thing is turning in like playing the game, winning and losing, moving the pieces on the chessboard. I mean, like that's what's exciting about this thing. And if you continue to do it, and with your customer in mind, and focused on the value that you were trying to create, like the money sort of will come. I it's hard to see that, like people say, hey, I want to do this because I want to just make this much money, or I want to, like, everything is sort of transactional. They do an analysis like, this is the amount of money I'm going to make. But if you really are focused on a business and you want to be invested in it for some time, and you start to think about the value proposition that you're trying to deliver, the money comes. It's a phenomenon in business. Like if you're doing the right things, and you're putting one foot in front of the other, and you're giving your customers the value, or more of the value that they expect, the money comes. And so ultimately, that the decisions around keeping capacity and keeping things are always in line with the original business value and opportunity, and less about the profitability, sure, there's a cost to that. Some people say, well, that's crazy, and there's a cost to it. Well, then take that cost and roll it into the 80% of the business and charge your customers an extra 2% or whatever it is. But that 2% they're willing to pay because I have that flexibility when they need that moment to happen. I have to be able to deliver. If I can't deliver on that, then they might as well save 2% and go to a big guy and just deal with whatever they have to deal with.
That's
And that's, that was sort of one of the key understandings
yeah,
for us.
that's the difference of staying at the Fairmont or the Holiday Inn. Right? You're going to pay for the added service.